In human history, there has been one horrifying tragedy that completely overturned the world's traditional understanding of psychological control. In 1978, deep in the jungles of Guyana, Jonestown became a place where ordinary human life was reduced to obedience, fear, and death. Within just a few hours, 909 people died, including 276 innocent children. It was not a battlefield. It was not a natural disaster. It was not a massacre carried out by strangers breaking into a helpless community. What made Jonestown almost impossible to process was something far darker. Most of the people there had been psychologically prepared for that final moment long before it happened. They had families. They had memories. They had reason. They had once lived normal lives under the same sun as everyone else. But by the end, their inner world had been rebuilt so completely that death could be presented as loyalty, obedience could be mistaken for love, and surrender could feel like salvation. Jonestown did not terrify the world only because so many people died. It terrified the world because it proved that the human mind can be led into a prison without ever seeing the bars. The victims were not born insane. They were not born weak. They were not born wanting to die. They were ordinary people who were slowly separated from everything that could have helped them resist: family, outside information, personal doubt, moral judgment, and finally, their own identity. This is the real horror of brainwashing. It does not begin with madness. It begins with comfort. It does not begin with chains. It begins with belonging. It does not begin by saying, "Obey me." It begins by whispering, "I understand you better than anyone else ever has." Jim Jones understood this with terrifying precision. In the beginning, he did not appear as a monster. He appeared as a rescuer. He spoke about racial equality, social justice, compassion, protection for the poor, and dignity for people who had been ignored by society. To many of his followers, the People's Temple was not a cult. It was a shelter. It was a family. It was a place where the wounded could finally stop feeling invisible. Jones did not start by demanding death. He started by offering meaning. He did not start by asking people to abandon themselves. He first convinced them that their old selves had already been abandoned by the world. That is the first step of brainwashing. Find the wound, not stupidity, not weakness, a wound, loneliness, grief, shame, poverty, rejection, spiritual emptiness, family trauma, a failed life, a desperate need to be seen. A manipulator studies these wounds like a map. Then he offers the exact thing the wounded person has been starving for: love, certainty, identity, purpose, and a new explanation for their pain. Jones told people, directly or indirectly, that their past suffering had a reason, that the outside world was corrupt, and that only inside the movement could they become whole. This is how the trap begins. A person does not feel controlled. They feel healed. They feel chosen. They feel rescued. And once a person mistakes control for rescue, the cage has already begun to close. The next step is emotional flooding. New members are praised, embraced, surrounded, and treated like they have finally arrived home. People who spent years feeling worthless suddenly feel important. People who were ignored suddenly feel noticed. People who were broken suddenly feel useful. This is not random kindness. It is psychological bonding. The group becomes the source of emotional oxygen. The leader becomes the person who gave them life back. And once someone depends on the group for emotional survival, the group can begin to change the rules. What looked like unconditional love becomes conditional belonging. You are loved as long as you obey. You are valued as long as you agree. You are safe as long as you do not question. Slowly, the follower learns that approval is life and rejection is death. This is where brainwashing becomes deeper than belief. It becomes emotional survival. Jones then moved into the next stage, replacing outside reality. Family members who questioned the group became enemies. Friends became negative influences. Journalists became liars. Former members became traitors. Society became diseased. The government became a threat. Every outside voice was reinterpreted before it could reach the follower's mind. This is one of the most important mechanisms of brainwashing. The leader does not need to defeat the truth if he can control the meaning of every truth before the victim hears it. If someone criticizes the group, that proves they are evil. If the media investigates, that proves the group is being persecuted. If a family begs someone to leave, that proves the family is selfish. If a former member warns others, that proves the former member is corrupted. Every possible exit sign is repainted as danger. Every alarm is turned into proof that the leader was right. This is how a closed mental universe is built. The follower still has eyes, but the leader controls what they are allowed to see. The follower still has ears, but the leader controls what every outside voice means. The follower still has thoughts, but doubt itself becomes a crime. Then comes language control. High control groups always create their own vocabulary because language is the architecture of thought. The world is divided into pure and corrupt, loyal and traitorous, awakened and blind, saved and doomed. Complex reality is crushed into simple labels. Once a person accepts the group's language, they begin thinking inside the group's prison. They no longer say, "My family is worried about me." They say, "My family is trying to pull me away from the truth." They no longer say, "I have doubts." They say, "I am spiritually weak." They no longer say, "The leader hurt someone." They say, "Enemies are attacking the mission." This is how brainwashing quietly changes the mind. It does not only change what people believe, it changes the words they use to describe their own fear. And once fear can only be described through the leader's language, the victim loses the ability to fully understand what is happening to them. But the darkest stage is emotional torture disguised as moral correction. Manipulators use cycles of warmth and cruelty. One moment, the follower is praised as special, chosen, pure, and necessary. The next moment, they are humiliated, shamed, accused, and told they are selfish, weak, impure, or dangerous to the mission. This alternating rhythm creates psychological addiction. The follower becomes desperate to return to the warmth and terrified of the cold. They begin monitoring themselves. They confess more. They obey faster. They suppress doubt before anyone else hears it. Eventually, the leader does not need to police every thought because the follower has learned to police themselves. That is the true victory of brainwashing, when the prison guard moves inside the victim's own mind. In Jonestown, this control became more extreme as the group became more isolated. The jungle was not just a location, it was a weapon. Far from home, far from relatives, far from outside institutions, followers were trapped in a world where Jones controlled the story of everything. Exhaustion, surveillance, public humiliation, fear of enemies, loyalty tests, and constant speeches created a reality where people could barely separate personal thought from collective pressure. Reports from survivors describe an atmosphere where people were watched, criticized, and pressured to prove loyalty again and again. Jones repeatedly warned that enemies were coming. He framed death not as defeat, but as resistance, not as murder, but as sacrifice, not as horror, but as revolutionary purity. This is how the mind is prepared for the unthinkable, not in one command, but through repeated rehearsals. The so-called White Knights conditioned followers to imagine collective death before the final day arrived. The nightmare was practiced emotionally before it became physical. By the time the final moment came, the poison was only the last instrument. The real weapon had been built over years: dependency, isolation, fear, exhaustion, obedience, shame, and the destruction of independent moral judgment. And the children make the darkness almost unbearable. They did not understand ideology. They did not choose a leader. They did not consent to a mission. They were carried into a world where adults had already surrendered their ability to resist. In Jonestown, even the future was swallowed by the leader's control. That is the most monstrous power of brainwashing. It does not only make people destroy themselves, it can make them participate in the destruction of the people they love most, while believing there is no other way. This same black pattern appears in Aum Shinrikyo. At first, Aum did not look like a machine of terror. It looked like spiritual healing. In Japan during the 1980s and 1990s, many people were under pressure, isolation, social competition, and spiritual emptiness. Shoko Asahara entered that emptiness with promises of meditation, liberation, supernatural truth, and escape from worldly suffering. He attracted students, professionals, educated people, and ordinary citizens who were not stupid and not naturally violent. That is why the case is so disturbing. These people did not walk in looking for murder. They walked in looking for peace. At first, they found calm routines, spiritual language, community, and the feeling that ordinary life had been shallow compared to the truth they had discovered. Then the same machinery began to move. The group isolated them from outside influences. The leader became the final interpreter of reality. The outside world became polluted. Ordinary morality was redefined as ignorance. Followers were taught to distrust their own perception and surrender to a higher truth controlled by Asahara. The deeper they went, the less they belonged to normal society. The more they sacrificed, the harder it became to admit the sacrifice was meaningless. And eventually, a movement that began with the promise of enlightenment produced the 1995 Tokyo subway sarin attack. Ordinary commuters entered trains expecting a normal morning. Instead, poison entered the city's bloodstream. The true horror of Aum is that the road to terror began with meditation, spiritual hunger, and the promise of purification. It shows that brainwashing does not always drag people downward through hatred. Sometimes it lifts them upward through the fantasy of becoming pure, chosen, and beyond ordinary morality. Heaven's Gate revealed another form of darkness, the total replacement of reality. In 1997, 39 members died in a mass suicide in California, believing that leaving their bodies would allow them to reach a higher existence connected to the Hale-Bopp comet. To outsiders, this seems impossible to comprehend. But inside the group, everything had been reorganized around one final story. Their language, clothing, routines, relationships, hopes, fears, and even their understanding of the body had been rebuilt. When the body itself is redefined as a temporary container, death can be reframed as departure. When the leader controls the meaning of life and death, survival instinct can be rewritten as spiritual failure. This is the final stage of brainwashing, when reality no longer protects the victim because reality itself has been replaced. Death no longer looks like death. It looks like transformation. Obedience no longer looks like submission. It looks like awakening. The self no longer feels like something to protect. It feels like something to erase. Modern psychological control is even more dangerous because it often no longer looks religious, extreme, or strange. It can wear the language of wellness, productivity, trauma healing, business coaching, elite networking, spiritual growth, leadership training, or self-improvement. NXIVM is a brutal example. It presented itself as a high-level personal development organization. It promised empowerment, discipline, growth, success, and transformation. Educated, ambitious, successful people entered because they believed they were improving themselves. But beneath the polished surface were hierarchy, coercion, shame, secrecy, and exploitation. Members could be drawn into systems where personal secrets became weapons, vulnerability became leverage, and the desire for growth became a path into submission. That is what makes modern brainwashing so insidious. It does not say, "I will control you." It says, "I will help you become your best self." It does not say, "Give me your freedom." It says, "Your resistance is the reason you are not free yet." It does not say, "Stop thinking." It says, "Your doubt is just fear blocking your transformation." This is why early control feels almost impossible to detect. It feels like healing. It feels like discipline. It feels like a breakthrough. But healthy growth makes a person more independent. Brainwashing makes a person more dependent. Healthy healing expands the world. Brainwashing shrinks it. Healthy leadership can survive questions. Brainwashing turns questions into sin. The full system usually works through 4 layers. First, behavior control, sleep, food, time, clothing, work, money, relationships, and daily routines are gradually reorganized around the group. Exhaustion weakens resistance. Repetition dulls judgment. Constant activity leaves no space for private thought. Second, information control. Outside sources are filtered, criticized, blocked, or reinterpreted. The victim no longer receives reality directly. Reality arrives through the leader's filter. Third, thought control. Doubt is labeled weakness, obedience is labeled virtue, and the leader's logic becomes the only acceptable logic. Fourth, emotional control. Guilt, fear, shame, hope, love, and rejection are used as invisible chains. When all four layers work together, the person may still say, "I chose this." But the self that chooses has already been redesigned. This is the darkest secret of brainwashing. It does not always force people to act against their will. It reshapes the will itself. It changes what a person wants, fears, loves, remembers, and believes they are. That is why victims often defend the system that harms them. To admit the truth would mean losing not just a belief, but an identity. It would mean admitting that the family they found was a trap, the mission they served was a lie, the years they sacrificed were stolen, and the person they became was engineered by someone else. That realization is so painful that the mind may reject it completely. Denial becomes self-defense, justification becomes survival. Loyalty becomes a shield against collapse. The deeper the investment, the harder the escape. Every manipulative system also needs an enemy. The enemy may be the government, the media, former members, unbelievers, family, doctors, society, or anyone who questions the leader. The enemy makes fear useful. Fear makes obedience feel necessary. Obedience keeps the leader powerful. This is the cycle. Create danger, then offer protection. Create isolation, then call it purity. Create dependence, then call it love. Create exhaustion, then call it devotion. Create control, then call it truth. By the time outsiders recognize the danger, the people inside may already believe outsiders are the danger. That is why the question, "Why didn't they just leave?" is too simple. Leaving means walking out of a universe. It means learning to think again. It means facing shame, grief, lost years, broken relationships, and the unbearable possibility that the person who seemed to save you was the one who destroyed you. Brainwashing is one of the darkest forms of power because it teaches the mind to guard its own prison. Most people believe they are too intelligent to be brainwashed. That belief is dangerous. Intelligence does not erase loneliness. Education does not erase grief. Confidence does not erase the hunger for meaning. Anyone can become vulnerable when life opens a wound and someone arrives with the perfect answer. Across history, the pattern remains terrifyingly consistent. Find the wound, offer salvation, flood the victim with belonging, isolate them from outside reality, control their language, punish their doubt, exhaust their resistance, create enemies, replace their identity, and finally dress the entire prison in the words love, truth, healing, destiny, or freedom. The most terrifying manipulators do not begin by asking you to die for them. They begin by making you believe they are the only reason you are finally alive. And by the time the darkness reveals itself, the victim may already be calling it light. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more dark psychology, hidden manipulation, and the buried truths behind human nature.